I speak a lot about breaking rules here, but today we're going to toe the line and try to understand when watercolor rules are at their finest and why. Because if we figure that out, we're going to better know when exactly breaking a painting rule will be most effective in our work. We'll be painting a super realistic, for me, Cosmo. You know, those late summer beauties. They get all leggy and weird and 5 feet tall, but are crowned with one of the summer's latest, most beautiful blooms. At least in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I'm from. Anywho, enough of the bad poetry. I'm diving in here with a sketch to get my flower structure under control. Basic shapes and light pressure. If you want to know more about my approach to sketching, I'm going to link a playlist below that you're going to want to check out later on. Now, before we get into the how-to of this super realistic painting, I want to talk about the two most important rules that are going to be coming up again and again today. Rule number 1, start with super light washes of watercolor, meaning light color, meaning lots of water. Yeah, you get the drill. And here's why this makes sense in most cases. Watercolor is often sheer if we use it traditionally. And that means it's see-through. So starting darker and trying to add light moments later on just doesn't work well. Unless you've got a more opaque watercolor, but I digress. This is the rule, though, that I most often break. Now, rule number 2 that's really important are big washes built up to fine detail. That means big washes first, and of course, light washes according to rule 1. And bigger strokes first, and then slowly build up your detail with finer and finer and finer brush strokes made from smaller brushes. The why here, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. If we started with all the fine, super detail, then we'd be covering it all up with the bigger washes to create form and shape and dimension and shadow, and that just doesn't make sense visually. But you guessed it, this is also a rule that I tend to break. But remember, today is not about breaking the rules, but figuring out why we follow them so we know better when to break them. Oh my gosh, that was like a artsy, creative tongue twister of sorts. Are you still with me? If you are, head to comments and say, heck yes, let's do this. All right, I mentioned the sketching earlier, and while I start with the basic center of the flower, just know that I'm using some handmade watercolors today, and I will be including some shimmers, and I'm using the Arches Sketchbook, and I'm gonna link all the supplies below. All right, friends, started with that light circle in the middle, and then I've got some kind of long, ill-shaped ovals coming out from that circle center. Some of them are overlapping, so some are on top and some are underneath. And then as I continue and kind of get my sketching sea legs, so to speak, I'm starting to press heavier on this 3H pencil that I'm using. If you don't have a 3H pencil, you just have a regular old school pencil, then just make sure you're super careful not to press hard at all, and you'll get nice fine lines. I am adding a little bit of detail around the center just to make myself feel good. The Cosmo flower has a very distinctive kind of end of the petal, and so I'm making some notation of that with my edits in the sketch, but a lot of that can be done as we add our layers and washes later on. This is enough. I'm heading in with my 1/2-inch dagger, and I'm just going to wet this first petal. So you guessed it, this is going to be wet on wet, and this is a very classic traditional way to start watercolor. And it's not the way I often start. I often start wet on dry with color. All right, now I'm floating in some really soft, like a pinky lavender into this wet petal. Very light. There's maybe about 10% pigment at first. The rest is water. And then I'm starting to add a little bit more of that lavender color. It's more of a pink, but you know, somewhere in between out towards the tip. And that's it for that petal. I'm gonna move on to the next petal and kind of repeat this very light, wet on wet, washy process. And you'll see me here kind of dabbing in darker color as I go. And this is even me starting to slightly break the traditional watercolor rule of light washes first, because as you can see, some of those dabs of color are pretty intense. I'm going right on the edge here while that petal is still wet, adding a little bit more of like a salmon color, salmon tone. Remember, these are handmade watercolors. I'm not gonna call out exact colors or pigment numbers. I wouldn't have done that anyway, but you know how I flow. Friends, if you're new here though, let me know. We'd love to know and welcome you to the community. Go ahead into comments and say new here, and we will be sure to give your comment a like or say hi or all the things. But yeah, let me get back to painting, but we are happy you're here. And I'm just gonna continue around the entire kind of circumference, is that the right word? Circumference of the flower, whatever. I'm gonna go around and I'm going to approach each petal the same way that I did the first, pretty much the same. I mean, nature is nature and God didn't make anything exactly the same in nature. So, you know, who am I? I'm not gonna do that either, but the basic approach is very similar on each petal. The focus here is to stay very light. You can make decisions and build up intensity as we go. And yeah, let's see how this turns out. All right, so clearly I can never go all the way with the rules. I didn't finish those last two petals, but I'm going in with a number 2 round. Everything is still damp because, friends, I'm working on arches. It's 100% cotton. It stays wet really long. And I'm going in with some of the same colors that I used already, just a little more intense. So instead of 10% paint, it's more about 30 or 40% paint, the rest water. And I am actually starting to build up some detail. But notice, I'm actually breaking one of the rules because I went from big washes right to small, fine detail. Now, spoiler alert, I'm gonna actually tell you, this is gonna work. This is gonna still give me a more realistic effect. But there is a secret, and we'll talk about it later. You'll just have to stick around. As you'll notice, I'm dropping in a little bit of brighter, like reddish terracotta color on the tip of that top petal. Remember, everything's still damp. Friends, if you are painting along with me and yours is not still damp, all you have to do is add a little bit of clean water over top and you'll be good to go to continue on with me. Now I'm over on the left-hand side, really intensifying, and yeah, starting to subtly break those rules. And this one in particular is that I am going from a very, very light wash here on the left-hand petal to a very, very intense wash. And I didn't really go in between, but you guessed it, it's still gonna work. It's still gonna be, I think, realistic-ish. Actually, let me ask you, do you think that me starting to fudge on these watercolor rules is still going to give me a realistic effect when it's all said and done? Let me know. Just get into comments and say yes or no and explain why. And that's one of the reasons I love this community. We have the best conversations. Notice I am still using that number 2 round brush, and I am really focusing on those points or the ends of the Cosmo petals. I love just messing around with the edges of a petal. I'm not trying to outline, so it's not a continuous dark kind of line that I'm adding around the whole edge, but just getting in some of those strong shadows in areas while everything is still damp creates the most gorgeous gradients from light to dark. And remember, when you have the wet page, when a page is damp or wet, that is an opportunity. I say it all the time. So certainly it's an opportunity, number 1, to add more color to whatever it is that you're painting. So if you have a little bit of pink and the page is damp with pink, then you can add a little bit of red and let it flow and see what happens. Number 2, you can also use that as an opportunity to edit shapes. If an entire shape is still damp or wet, you can edit the silhouette of that shape so easily and not worry about any dried hard edges. All right, friends, we're gonna move on to the next step soon, but I gotta know, are you enjoying this play-by-play, step-by-step paint along of this Cosmo? If you are, head into comments and let me know, say yes. And yeah, let's just get on with it. Actually, no, let's not get on with it yet. If you have a moment and you're feeling so inclined, I would love a boop on this video. What's a boop, you ask? It's a like, and it really helps out my channel, so thank you. All right, going back in with my 1/2 inch dagger because I realize, of course, I have to finish these last 2 petals. So I'm getting into it. Same applies, light washes, dabbing in some light color as I continue to evolve this Cosmo. You can see me working back and forth between a kind of a soft lavendery fuchsia color and a really bright red. But because I'm using so little of that red into a wet paper surface, it's really diffusing and working out really well for the very beginnings of shading or shadows. All right, I'm bringing that number 2 round back out. And at this point, friends, everything that I was painting originally is dry. So I'm starting to work in more detail onto a dry page. So now we are officially wet on dry. So the lines are going to be crisper, especially if I have more or a higher ratio of paint to water on my brush. So great little tip to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and wash in the center of this flower. I was just kind of getting my sea legs with a little bit more of this crisp detail. But let's talk about rules again as I continue to evolve this, and just notice what I'm doing with the center of the flower and when I start to do with some shading in that darker burgundy color. But rules. So I talked about rule number 1 and rule number 2 in the beginning, those 2 rules that are so integral to watercolor, traditional classic watercolor painting. I started with big washes, rule number 1, but I very quickly went to small washes. And the question posed was, is this going to still give me a realistic result? And I'm still confident. And that's exciting because that means that breaking the rules can still give me traditional outcomes, but with non-traditional approaches. All right, let's get into the leaves. I am just going wet on dry. I did not sketch in any leaves, and I'm just doing a little bit of a press and then a feathery drag. I am letting that paint run out on my brush. Cosmo leaves are very feathery. They're kind of thick in the body, and then they very quickly feather out on the little edges all along the silhouette of the leaf. And they look kind of like aliens. So when you first start painting them, they feel really weird, but this is definitely a trust the process moment. I kind of followed the rule of laying down just a light wash, but it's honestly not too light, right? And then I immediately went into some detail and dark, intense, kind of juicy on damp watercolor. So already breaking those 2 rules again, but I'm hovering, right? I'm kind of hovering on that line between rule follower and rule breaker. I'm so excited for you to see where this lands. And if you have no idea what I meant by juicy on damp, I get it. It's a weird phrase. I'm gonna link a video below that will explain it all. All right, I'm still working into that leaf and I'm kind of editing. Remember I mentioned before about editing when the page is wet, and I'm doing just that. And it's making the job of editing the edges of that feathery, wispy leaf that much easier because everything is still damp. All right, now I'm getting serious about detail. I'm bringing out the liner brush from the Art for Joy's Sake brush collection. Remember, all the supplies are going to be linked below. And I'm going with a true lavender here. It's kind of a grayed out lavender. So, you know, if you have a purple and like a gray or a Payne's gray, even a little brown, that'll do you. Lots of water. And then I'm immediately blending some of it away with clean water. So here's a great moment to notice. Here, I broke a rule because I went from just big washes to super fine detail, one right after the other. But then I kind of washed out some of that fine detail. So I'm like on a teeter-totter of watercolor tradition, and it's kind of cool. I don't know, what do you think? Now I'm going back in with the liner brush and the page is damp again. So I am getting those soft, diffused detail lines because the page is damp and everything's just softly zhuzhing and gelling with one another. I'm just testing the dampness of the page up there. Fully dry up in the upper kind of right-ish area. And that tells me any kind of stronger pigment or paint to water ratio on my brush right now is going to be very crisp on the page. It's going to give me a very strong contrast. And so I don't want to have too much paint on my brush at this point to kind of maintain that realism effect, right? because I'm trying to build up slowly. At least I'm trying to rein myself in, right? I keep breaking these rules, but then I keep reining myself back in. I'm going to give you a break from me and all the talking, and let's see how this next section unfolds. All right, friends, I took some time here and started building up the two top petals. And I did that by adding really dark moments where one petal overlapped with another. And this is the point in a painting where you decide which petal's on top, which petal's underneath. And that gives you an idea of which direction you should blend out that dark color from dark to light. Now, I do have a tip here. I don't recommend completely, quote unquote, finishing one petal at a time. Get it to a point where you're feeling good about it, where you don't feel like you've overworked it, where you definitely feel like there's more work to do, and move on. It's going to help you gain perspective elsewhere in the painting. Like right now, I'm in that bottom right corner, and I'm adding some like medium-sized washes with the tip of my 1/2-inch dagger. They're definitely not as fine as the washes I've been adding to this point. And then boom, I did another one there, almost at the very bottom of the flower. And see how I'm defining kind of the middle of that petal with some bigger strokes. And I'm doing that, and I'm realizing I need to do that because I was able to step away from those top two petals and realize I was getting too in it to win it with the teeny tiny details everywhere. And I realized I wanted some bolder, stronger, bigger stroked shadows. But I wouldn't have had that perspective most likely if I had just kept working each petal to its completion one after another. So yeah, perspective is so important. And the only way you can get it is by stepping back and moving on to another part of your painting. All right, so here I'm sticking to the rules, friends. I'm at that bottom petal and I went from big washes, let them dry. Now I'm glazing over top some medium washes. And those medium washes are taking the next step in defining the form and the shadow of that petal. And of course, I'm working back up into those other petals I was working on before. But again, I love working like that because it keeps my eyes fresh and my decision making really, really sharp. This is a technique that I call positive lifting. Lifting is always thought of in most cases as a negative thing because we're trying to fix or remove something. And yeah, I'm moving on to the leaves and the buds, but just hear me out. Positive lifting is when you want to remove some color because you want to reveal some texture from underneath, because some cool stuff can happen when you positively lift or take something away because you know it's going to create a cool texture. And I have a video, of course, all about how some of the classic techniques in watercolor intersect and overlap one another, so you might want to watch that. It's linked below for later on. All right, adding some big washes to those buds and then just going freestyle, wet on dry on the left-hand side here and adding some more leafy moments. Now this one, I'm approaching a little bit more of a modern watercolor style where it's just a bunch of simple strokes put together to kind of create the idea or the essence of a leaf. I'm immediately going in now with a much darker, more intense, juicy on dry brush, full of that darker, more intense green. And I like it. I'm popping back over to the right-hand side and continuing to add some little details in the veins of the leaves and all that kind of good stuff. But let's pause here for a moment, friends. The question that I posed at the very beginning is, what basically are we going to learn from following the rules, and I believe we're going to learn when it's best to break the rules. So far, though, what I'm seeing is that when you break the rules in stages or in increments and don't just full on break them all in a big, bold way all at once, you still can maintain that level of classic watercolor realism, so to speak. Now, this is all with the caveat of I am not the most realistic painter. This is realistic for me. And I gotta admit, friends, even if you don't want to stick around for me to answer the philosophical question that I'm going to answer later on about watercolor rules and breaking them, I think this is still going to end up to be a really nice step-by-step how to paint a watercolor Cosmo. So I'm glad you're here. All right, moving on to the next stage, and don't get nervous, friends. I let this dry overnight. It's a different day and the light is a little different, but I promise you, this is the same painting. All right, as I continue on with this bad boy, just a few reminders of the rules that we've been talking about today. Rule number 1, classic watercolors. Start with light washes of color first and build up to more intense shadow and bright colors. And rule number 2 that we're examining is build up your detail. Start with big washes and then slowly build up your detail with finer and finer brush strokes. But if you've been along for the ride, you know that I'm kind of following those rules, but breaking them every here, there, and yeah, well, you know. And oddly enough, now at this point, at this stage in the painting, I'm kind of going back to those medium-sized washes that I should have done. Yeah, air quotes right now. I'm totally making the air quotes earlier in the painting. I'm using a glazing effect where you add one color over top of another color that's already been dried on the page. And right now that's giving me incredible depth and even a little bit more detail. And it's also helping these petals kind of pop and make it more obvious which ones are going behind and which ones are coming forward. And I'm doing all of that right over top of some of the fine detail that I've already added, some would say too early. But I want you to notice something. In my humble opinion, I think it's working. It's allowing me to add a really nice soft glow and subtly build up my shadows while still allowing those fine details to shine through in a curious way. And I do still think it's feeling kind of realistic, despite my complete inability to 100% follow the rules, even though that was my intention starting out. Now, it's time to head into comments because I've got to know, do you agree? Do you feel like this is feeling realistic-ish? Or if not, tell me why. I promise you're not going to hurt my feelings. Back to the how-to, friends. I'm going into that left-ish petal. It's almost the one at the complete bottom. And I'm glazing over using my 1/8 inch dagger, a little bit of a bright fuchsia pink. And yeah, I'm going right over top some fine details that I added earlier, but it's working. Now I'm heading over to the right side, this petal here, same brush, and I'm adding some lavender detail along that petal's left side. And then going in with some clean water and blending it out back and forth, up and down, to kind of soften that lavender intensity that I just added. And it's a little strong. I'm not sure if I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to decide later. All right, going into another petal here on the direct right, adding some really bright pink, a nice stroke down there, right down the side, and then a few shorter strokes, and then right back in with some water, blending it out. This is basically an ombre technique, or a pulling technique as it's traditionally called. And notice again, going right over top of some fine linear detail that was added with one of my teeniest brushes earlier on. Feeling like defining the center here, so same brush, 1/8 inch dagger. I'm using kind of a medium orange and going along the bottom left-ish side with some dabs and dots. There's a good amount of water on my brush right now and not as much color, and those dots are kind of starting to blend into one another to add a nice textury, soft medium shadow. Now I'm starting to kind of create some depth around the center of this flower where it hits each of the petals. And you can see how I'm taking some of that wet paint, that medium orange that I just laid down, and I'm stroking down into the petal with a very light touch, a clean, damp brush, and I'm using some of that color very softly to carry into some linear detail in the petals. And you can really start to see the kind of a round, bulbous, spherical kind of shape of that center taking place. Now my eyes need a rest from that area. I'm popping on over to the leaf on the right-hand side and taking some very intense green. You can mix whatever green you have with the brown or with the blue or with a little bit of purple or all of that, and you're gonna get a nice rich green. And I am really focusing on where the leaf meets the petal there. And I'm using this opportunity to add some intensity where those two elements intersect, but then also to carry some of what's left on my brush out into the wispy edges of the leaf. And it's creating a dry brush effect, which is basically very textured, but it's also allowing me to keep the effect really soft and not terribly heavy. All right, going right back into the center of that flower because I just can't help myself. I do have still a little bit of the green on that brush, but I added a little bit of pink. And friends, by the way, now I've brought in my Art for Joy's Sake palette just because I felt like it, going back and forth between both palettes now. And I'm really starting to cut in, notch out that flower center, but I'm doing it subtly. Going back to rule number 1, I'm building up my washes, the intensity of the washes slowly so that I get that intensity build up, but I'm doing it slow so I have time to make decisions or change course. This is another great way where following the rules actually really helps the end result of your painting. By building up those washes slowly from light to dark, you give yourself a chance to really make good informed decisions and you're not working too quickly and kind of skipping over some of the important stuff. All right, how are we feeling? You still with me? I'm glad. All right, now that I've explained the basic techniques that I'm using in this section of the painting, I'm gonna zip it for a while and let you watch this unfold. But I promise we're gonna get to the answer. Does following the rules really help us get to a more realistic result? And when is it best to break the rules? We're gonna be there soon. All right, we are heading into the final stages of this painting. I'm using my two tiniest brushes, my liner and my 000, both a sampling from each of my brush collections. Remember, all the supplies are listed below. Friends, this section is really a matter of preference and taste. I'm gonna take it all the way, but you could easily stop at this point. It's lovely. There's beautiful stuff going on. You might want to add a little suggestion of a stem there over on the right, but yeah. But I'm gonna go all the way. I'm gonna follow the rule of slowly building up fine detail. After many, many moments of following the rules, breaking the rules, tiny detail, medium detail, all the things. But now I'm gonna go in and really try to fine tune the detail of this painting because I'm trying to get the most realistic effect I can in this moment. At this stage in a more realistic painting, I am looking back at my inspiration image a lot more than in the beginning stages. And I am making decisions about where to add more detail, where to add more shadow, Where does one petal just not look like it's coming forward or going backward, and I need to kind of visually explain it more? These are the kind of things I'm thinking about. I'm defining edges more, parts of the silhouette of a single petal, making sure that I'm not adding so much detail evenly everywhere that it's starting to look like an outline. These are some more things that I'm thinking about at this stage. Now, I promised you I would answer a question, and I think it's a big one that we talked about earlier. How important are the rules, especially if you're going after a more realistic effect? And I think what my answer is, in fact, I know my answer is this: they're not as important as you think they are. And that's a big claim, I realize. Let me explain. Following the rules of watercolor to get a certain result is more about the intensity of following the rules or subsequently breaking them. If you intensely break a rule over and over again early in a painting, that is definitely going to dictate the kind of style and the level of realism that you can get. But if you systematically and subtly go back and forth between following a painting rule and breaking it, you're still going to be able to accomplish a truly realistic result. Because what I just described is exactly what I've done this entire time. I would break rules, but I would break them subtly. I would start by following rules, and then I'd break them for a few moments in a painting, and then go back to the majority of the painting following the rules again. And what's the point in discussing all of this? It might sound like a lot of just creative mumbo jumbo, but it's not. We get so hung up on the rules and how important we need to follow step 1, 2, 3, and 4 perfectly and without any deviation so that we can get the perfect, beautiful, satisfying result. But I'm here to free you from that because I've just proven that you can get a really satisfying, even dare I say, realistic result by being a little loosey-goosey on the rules front. Now, you might not agree with me, and that's okay, and you can tell me all about it in comments. But here we've come to the proverbial end of this Cosmo realistic watercolor painting, and I want you to be the judge. Was my subtle breaking of the rules and seesawing between the two effective? Let me know what you think. And I'm sure you're curious and you want to dive more into realistic watercolor and glazing and all the things that make this style happen effortlessly. And if that's the case, you're going to want to watch this video next where I paint a tulip for you. And until next time, friends, I wish you so much happy painting.